So I'm with Luca Enriques, the Professor of Corporate Law at the Oxford University Faculty of Law. And Luca, in your most recent paper, Mandatory Corporate Climate Disclosures Now But How, you consider the question of corporate climate change disclosures. Although things are changing rapidly, I mean, to date we've had mainly voluntary approaches based around TCFD, Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures requirements. You argue that this has failed and that we now really need mandated disclosure. Why so?
Well, the TCFD was a very important step in the right direction, and it has focused to some degree investors and issuers' mind on this important topic. However, as you said, it's a voluntary framework, and that has led to two things. First of all, issuers can still choose whether to disclose. Many do, but others don't. Second, they can also pick and choose what to disclose, how to disclose it, and where to disclose it, which leads not only to, of course, a lack of uniformity in the disclosure, because there will be cherry picking of what you disclose, but also some opportunistic choices that may lead some to omit information that investors may consider relevant. That's the main reason why some degree of prescriptiveness in this area is warranted. The experience is good again, but it can be improved upon.
And one of the counter-arguments to that you particularly hear in the US is that there's already a requirement for firms to disclose material information, and of course climate change isn't material for every single firm, perhaps. So how would you respond to that? That this requirement is already there if it's a material issue.
Yeah, so the experience with the SEC guidance from 2010 is similar to the one I mentioned about the TCFD. It's not voluntary, but it leaves a huge amount of discretion on individual issuers to decide whether something is material to them, which also has led some to disclose less than what arguably may be optimal from the perspective of investors. That's the first thing. The other thing is, yes, we may think that climate change is something very much into the future. Actually, that's not the case. It has already. It is happening. The climate is changing, and when you issue new rules of this kind, they just not come into force the day after. So first of all, you need to approve it. So take the SEC's proposal. It's out, but it has not been approved. Some say it may be approved by the end of the year. That may be optimistic. Then there will be a phased-in enactment that will mean that the first disclosure, according to the new rules, will come out in 2025, but on some matters it will be 2028, so very much down the road from today. And of course now we can think that this phenomenon will only hit seriously in a decade or so, but we're almost there in terms of regulatory action in this area.
I see. And because obviously there's so much flux and change, I mean, what you do in your paper is you identify some principles for effective regulation. I'd like to pick up on a couple of those with you now. One of those that you talk about is reach and private versus listed companies. Now, it's a matter of fact that kind of most regulation at the moment is pointing at listed companies. What's your view on that?
So here there is an interesting divide between what the US can do and what Europe has done and can do. Because in the US you have a paralyzed Congress, so you cannot expect Congress to do anything in this area. But you have the SEC with its mandate on investor protection. That's the core mission and the way, the goal of any disclosure. So that means that the SEC has much less leeway in defining the reach of its own rule, because the protection of investors has to be the core goal. In Europe, you have actually the opposite scenario in which lawmakers are eager to legislate in this area and therefore have a much greater freedom to define what the scope of these rules is. and already with the non-financial disclosures directive from the last decade, the idea is there that when issues are material not only for investors but for society as a whole, the scope should not be contained to listed companies.
Yeah, okay. So this is going to be to some degree jurisdiction specific, I guess. Another area, a couple of areas I wanted to pick up was this idea that you say the disclosures need to go beyond TCFD requirements, and one of those was the need for standardised stress tests. Can you just expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I think the intuition there is very basic. What credence would you give to bank stress tests if each bank were able to design its own macroeconomic scenarios? And that's the state of the art with regard to climate-related disclosure. There is the requirement, let's call it requirement, TCFD, to have a scenario analysis, but the scenarios are defined by each individual issuer, which means that, again, they have a lot of freedom to come up with the rosiest possible scenario for themselves. Of course. And also comparability is ruled out from the start.
And I mean, maybe slightly connected to this. I mean, you state that there could be, one idea you have is that there could be more onerous or extensive requirements for sort of systemically significant climate firms, if you like. Is this an idea that you actually see getting traction? Because it seems very sensible to me, but is this something that you're seeing happening anyway?
Well, the sincere answer is no. I have had an exchange with representatives of investors which found the idea very interesting, but hard to square with where supervisory authorities, the SEC or European lawmakers are going. So I would say so. The intuition is very clear. If what you do has a much greater impact on climate, because you are one of the outliers in the amount of emissions, then perhaps knowing a little bit more about you may make sense, and that also allows for looser rules on those that you mentioned before may not run such a high risk in terms of transition.
Yeah, and I mean, and of course, particularly in Europe, but I mean elsewhere. I mean, this has a great precedent in terms of financial regulation, doesn't it? Where we have proportionality rules that
that's why, of course, our inspiration.
Yeah, interesting. And one thing that you point out is that all of these requirements, whether it's for development of specific scenarios, for stress testing or regulation in this area, it's going to demand much greater competence from regulators than perhaps they have today, and they have to build that. And you point to the fact that actually it's central banks that are probably doing the most to build this competence. But there is quite a lot of pushback at the moment about kind of mandate overreach from central banks. There's a worry that maybe they haven't done a great job spotting the inflation problem. Why should we think that they're actually the right people to address this climate problem? What would you say on that?
Well, first of all, it's always relative. I mean, they may have got it wrong, but perhaps better than in general. No, so everyone makes mistakes. And second, I understand the concerns, but I think they are more about the mandate of central banks than what we are thinking about. So there is a clear concern that if you give a central bank the objective of targeting climate change and making sure that there can be a transition, that clearly has an impact on their independence. We are only arguing that because there is expertise within central banks, you could use that expertise also to help design good rules about disclosures. That's more limited and shouldn't have an impact on their independence.
But I mean, I think the point of figuring out the regulatory kind of architecture for this area is extremely, extremely well made. And I mean, this is such a fast-moving field that, since you published your paper, we've had proposals come out from the UK and the US. And what do you think the biggest gap is in what you've seen?
Well, I would say, so on the UK side, there is this new proposal to basically introduce TCFD rules mandatory for all large issuers, basically. But what we find is that there is something in the small print that raises some eyebrows. In that, what they say is that each individual issuer will still have discretion to determine whether the disclosures that are quote-unquote required are in fact financially material.
Okay,
so they are left to that
takes us back
discretion.
to the discretion that we discussed
Exactly.
earlier.
It's a sort of new version of the SEC guidance from 2010 with more details about what to disclose, but still with the individual issuer making the final call on what to disclose. And on the US side, I think what the SEC has done is quite impressive, especially considering how divided the political parties are on this issue and the public as well. So I think the ambition is huge, and I don't feel like saying they didn't go far enough. If only for this reason. I will just express a concern, which is whether they can indeed have these rules not only approved but also coming into force, because there will be for sure litigation about whether they are in line with the Congress's mandate, and so we'll wait and see where that goes.
Yeah, we'll have to wait and see on that one. But that's been incredibly enlightening. Thanks very much for the conversation.
Thank you, Tom.